I'm Harry Guinness. I organise these events. I'm the Dublin representative for Atheist Ireland, and I'm joined today by Dr. Roger Yates from UCD.
Yeah, I'm here to represent the vegan contingent of Ireland against an avid flesh eater, apparently you said on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what we're basically going to do is we're just going to have a chat about atheism and veganism and the ethical issues surrounding that. Vegan Ireland approached me a few months ago about organising a speaker. It struck me as interesting because quite a few of the prominent members of Atheist Ireland are actually vegetarian, not vegan. And there was some discussion over whether vegetarians were more common in atheist groups or vegetarians were more likely to be atheists. I actually thought about that. One thing I thought was the thought process to become an atheist, where you have to actively question the status quo of being a Catholic in Ireland or whatever, is actually quite similar to the thought process of becoming a vegetarian or vegan. You've actually got to think about an issue that most people just don't. You know, if you look at most people who are nominally Catholic, a lot of them just simply haven't thought about the issue of whether or not they believe in God. And likewise, I'd imagine that there is a significant portion of people who just have not given any thought whatsoever to the issue of whether or not they should eat meat. I have given thought to the issue and I've decided I should eat meat. There's quite a few people in the room tonight, and Roger obviously, who've given thought to the issue and decided they should eat absolutely no meat, or, you know, not even wear animal products or products from animals. So, Roger, why are you a vegan?
Ooh, the hard ones first, eh? Well, I mean, for me, it's an ethical thing. I know there are people who describe themselves as environmental vegans and health vegans, but for me, it was always about ethics. And so back in the 1970s, I learned a few things, and first it was about the plight of seals and fishes, and so I went through a weird kind of 3-month period where I was boycotting the eating of fishes but not meat, and then I realised that didn't kind of make sense. Normally, what people do on their path,
the opposite.
Yeah, on the path to veganism, the usual pattern is to go vegetarian first, although this has been challenged at the moment. So I didn't do that, and I actually never got stuck in any kind of vegetarian phase, if you like.
Yeah, because that's quite interesting, because quite a lot of people seem to be only eat fish rather than eat any sort of meat, and you went the opposite.
Yeah, it was a weird kind of way into it, and actually it came from watching with my young children at the time John Craven's Newsround, which was a children's news thing, and they were interviewing some seal killers in the Orkneys. And I always remember the statement which said, well, we kill the seals because they're eating our fish. And that kind of bounced around in my head. Oh. And I thought, what do you mean, our fish? Oh. And my first thought about that was, well, surely all it means is that the seals got to the fish first.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I just thought about it more deeply. And at the same time, I was trying to join the Hunt Saboteurs. And the reason I was attracted to the Hunt Saboteurs was that they were asking for action and not money.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that appealed to my kind of activist streak, if you like.
Okay, so you got into it reasonably late then. It wasn't sort of teenage rebellion. You said that you became it when you had young children. I know it's almost a cliche or sort of thing that the child would rebel in their teenage years against their parents and become a vegetarian, but it's certainly, in my experience, I could well be wrong, that a lot of people do become vegetarian when they're 17, 18 and starting to think about things like that.
Well, certainly in terms of colleges, there was always all that kind of cliche.
Yeah.
That everybody goes vegetarian when they're at college and that kind of stuff. And obviously,
just the case.
Yeah, that would certainly be the case in the 60s and 70s. I think it's broken down a good deal now. In the same sense that, you would expect those university years or college years to be also the time when you were getting politicized. Yeah. You were getting radicalized by various things, including, Gardaí, truncheon. They always say that that's one of the most radicalizing things that can happen to you. But those kind of ideas have kind of, fizzled out a little bit now. And so, in general terms, academics in particular would probably claim that society is much more passive now. Okay. And there's kind of been forces of kind of pacification, which are quite complex. But I mean, going back to your first point, really, from a sociological point of view, what you're talking about, in your case and my case, is resisting our socialization. Because you were socialized as a Catholic and I was socialized as a speciesist, and we resisted it. And as I said in a talk recently, that's a relatively hard thing to do. And also, you're not doing yourself any favours. So the best thing to do, or the easiest thing to do, is to swim with the tide and not against it. Yeah. And so this is probably why, in effect, we're only just seeing the beginning of, I don't know, I mean, maybe that's too far to say, like the beginning of the end of Catholicism in Ireland, but it's starting to be questioned now. If you go back a generation, you'll probably find that the amount of people questioning it was very small.
Oh, well, most of my friends, very few of them would be in any way a devout Catholic or anyway go to Mass or even think about it. The only
they
ones,
go through the motions, probably.
Not even.
Right.
They wouldn't even go through the motions. The only ones who would be from the country, where it's very much a social thing. Most people I interact with on a day-to-day basis of my own age would be either atheist or not, agnostic essentially.
Yeah. Well, I would say that if you had to look at the demographics of the animal movement, I would think that there would be a large percentage of atheists and agnostics in it. Although,
are you an atheist? Or?
Yes, yeah, and or at least I think I am. I'm not that joke about. It's there is actually a debate within some parts of the animal movement at the moment about kind of what you might call spiritual based ideas in terms of informing their veganism, because some people assume that vegans would be atheists on the ground that it's the idea of looking rationally at an issue, and like you say in your Facebook, kind of dispensing with the supernatural, and dispensing with those kind of issues. And so, really, from a vegan point of view, an atheist audience should be wide open for our ideas, because in some senses, if you look at it, from a point of view of animal rights, or point of view of the environment, or point of view of health, then we've got all the arguments that should make you a vegan.
Okay. Well, this is not a point of mine. I think it was either Michael or Derek who I was talking to earlier in the week about this. Essentially, it was that religious people have this belief that animals were given to people to eat, which gives them a very possessive sense about them.
Yeah, well, God said I could. So
essentially, there's the God said I could rationalization for a Catholic or someone else to do it. I'm not saying that many do it or even think like that, but there's certainly the lack of questioning of that, because animals are for food and Jesus said so.
Well, actually, often that comes out in joke form, and quite often one of if somebody sees a vegan story or even a vegetarian story in the press, you'll often get comments like, well, if we weren't meant to eat animals, then why did God make them out of meat? Okay, which every meater thinks is an hilarious joke, ignoring the fact that we're also animals and we're also made out of meat as well. But that tends to be kind of tapping into a religious view on some level, or a religious argument on some level. What I found over the years, that usually the rationalizations of either Christians or meat eaters tend to be rather shallow, and so when you start to scratch it, you usually find there's nothing much there. And quite often you get the "well, God said I could" argument, which you don't have. So that's
the point I was making there. Was no, we don't have that argument.
Yeah. So which argument are you going to bring from?
I'm here to have a conversation.
What's your alternative?
Well, personally, I don't see an ethical issue.
Ah, okay.
That's to be perfectly blunt, I don't feel in any way guilty about eating meat. I don't know if you saw the poll we did on the Facebook page.
Yes. It's interesting that.
I was quite surprised.
There was quite a few who said that they felt guilty, right?
Yeah.
But the majority said that they didn't feel guilt.
No.
And so that, from my point of view, as a kind of researcher and a sociologist, is quite interesting, because it's a complicated issue about why they wouldn't.
Yeah.
And so if you don't, I'd like you to explain why you don't and how you construct the non-guilt eating of somebody else situation.
Well, I don't feel that they are somebody else.
Yeah.
There is something else that was there. From a psychological point of view, I'm a psychology student, for people who didn't know that, which is probably most of you. People generally feel a connection to people that are closest to them. You're much more likely to be defensive of your brother than you are of your neighbour, and likewise you're much more likely to be defensive of people who are in your own country rather than a different country. And obviously there's biases in there, But people tend to feel closer to things that are more and more similar to them. And as with animals, I don't feel any real connection.
Do you self-identify as an animal?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Do you self-identify as a mammal?
Yes.
And an ape?
Yes, to a lesser degree.
Okay.
But I don't consider myself up to the point that I'm going to sit in a tree and throw shit.
No, I wasn't going to ask that. I usually reserve that for later in the evening. But no, I mean, but in terms of your saying, well, you feel a disconnect.
Yes.
And now you just explained that you don't.
So well, I do. I feel that while I am a member of that, I'm
so it's kind of concentric circles with you. So it's kind of yourself, your family, your community, your nation. Yeah. You see, I mean, from my point of view, I think that if people took like in sociology now, the big deal is globalization. If people took seriously the idea that we are living in a global village, then that would be much better for the human being living on the planet. If we actually thought that everybody else was fellow villagers, as it were, because that would mean then that you wouldn't have 30,000 children dying of starvation-related issues, every single day. Yeah, including on 9/11, which is the kind of controversial point to make about that. But the point is, every single day we allow that.
Yes.
Okay. So when people say, well, let me ask you a question then, and see if I can develop the point. Do you think human beings are more important than other animals?
Yes.
Okay. So let's imagine two population explosions. You've got however many billion humans now. We're in between 6 and 7. Okay. But we've also got billions of non-human animals which we breed. It's not as though we capture them, right?
No.
Okay. Now, of those two populations, if the human beings were deficient in terms of food security, you would prioritize those, right? You would give the food to but that's not what we do. What we do is we give feed to the animals rather than food to the people.
That's not strictly relevant because the animals tend to be bred in countries where there isn't that, I'd imagine. Certainly the beef industry in America isn't really giving food to cows that would be given to children in Africa.
No, but that's the point. I mean, the point is, in terms of the kind of gross amount of foods that are produced, we could feed everyone. We could feed everyone.
Gross food is kind of a different issue. It's the same as the typical Irish mammy of eat your dinner. There's a starving child in Africa.
I'm not quite sure if that particular anecdote fits what I'm saying, but what I'm really saying is that even if you've got a situation where you've got areas set aside for feed, now often, and it's also relevant with cash crops as well, but often what you've got is the best land going to service the needs of other animals, through which you get your hamburgers. So if we were to radically alter that situation and take seriously the idea of human rights and the fact that humans really are allegedly more important, like everybody claims, then the first thing we would do is feed everybody. And we don't. We prefer to feed ourselves with hamburgers, which take a lot of feed, rather than giving food to the starving.
My counter to that is I don't, you're obviously much more knowledgeable on the issue than me, but I don't think there is that equivalency of food. A bushel of wheat in America is not the same as a bushel of wheat in Africa. You can't transport it as easily. There's international barriers to that, but there's also just time barriers, the cost of moving.
Well, we can transport soldiers all over the world. I'm sure we can transport food all over the world. I'm not convinced about that. It's a question of political will, and it's also a question of moral will in a sense. So in some senses, we give lip service to the idea of human rights, I believe, and if we really were very serious about that, I think we would organise society a lot differently. I mean, we'd think very critically about the capitalist mode of production, winners and losers and all that kind of stuff, but we certainly would, as a first priority, if the value system that you seem to have was prevalent throughout the world, you would then think, well, how come it isn't it the case that everyone is fed? It just doesn't seem to make sense.
Well, because as I was saying at the point, people feel more connection to people closer to themselves, and that starving children in Africa, most people ignore it on a daily basis because it's a world away.
And those same people those same people, if you ask them, would say that they would adhere to the principles of human rights.
Of course.
Okay.
There is that disconnect there that people, that human rights is a huge issue, and that people often just don't care that much.
Okay, so you're essentially saying that you've got these concentric circles, and that almost, if you like, creates some kind of nationalism or creates some kind of, community feeling for people, close to
closer,
yeah. And then you've got your nation, and then maybe some international relations, and that's why you feel that other animals are even further away, because people don't care about humans as well.
I care far more about children in Africa than I do about other animals. But it's almost bad to say, but I'm not doing anything about starving children in Africa. I'm sitting here having a discussion with Roger, and going to go home and going to sleep fine as people die all over the world. And if there was a moral issue that I wanted to crusade, then I'd fly to Africa and help them.
Ironically, one of the first things you could do to help them is to be vegan.
I don't really see how that would help.
Another issue, of course, is the fact that pollution doesn't respect national boundaries, and the environmental impact of meat eating is great. And so now we've got an issue that...
Do you differentiate between beef and chicken in terms of meat industry?
I differentiate between beef and chicken in several ways, in the sense that if you talk about the conversion rate in this argument, then the conversion rate from your argument is better in terms of chickens.
Oh, it is. I mainly eat chicken more so than beef. Yeah, except that beef does have issues with it.
Yeah. Which is interesting. You see, the language is interesting. I say chickens, you say chicken.
I eat chicken. I don't know.
That's right.
The food is chicken rather than...
Well, you eat chickens. So, it's quite interesting, because if you look at a ideology that separates, then it's linguistic in character. Speciesists will often, you already described other animals as things. So if you were describing the behavior of a dog, you might be saying it, or a cow, it, right? Rather than she or he.
Well, if I couldn't identify the gender. If I could identify the gender, I probably would use he or she.
Yeah, okay. So, often part of the prejudice, but also the ideological social construct, is built into the language as well, which some people are trying to kind of... in the same way as feminists try to challenge, patriarchal language, and the famous case there would be kind of, history became his story and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So there are people, and Joan Denea in particular, an animal rights theorist, trying to challenge linguistically what we do to the animals, which is to lessen their moral status by calling them it, and that pushes them away and creates that very social distance that you're claiming you rely on in order to eat them. So what we're suggesting is that if you thought more about the issue and about the way that it's been constructed, and you've already said that there are aspects of your life which you would resist your socialization. Oh, yeah. Well, what we're as vegans asking is for society to be reflexive, which is what atheists ask society to do, but on this issue as well as yours.
And I have actually considered the issue of vegetarianism rather than veganism, and I decided I don't care enough about not eating meat. I eat meat most meals. Some of you may notice I'm a little bigger than Roger. I'll arm wrestle if you want. I train about 8 times a day. Not 8 times a day, 8 times a week. In between weight training and other training and things like that. So I'm on a very high protein diet. I'd be eating about 100 grams of protein every day, which is 2 chicken breasts at 2 meals, as well as getting it, from grains and things like that, where you also get it. And so one point I actually wanted to discuss with you is how could someone like that, or like me, who trains as much as me, it becomes very, very difficult to maintain the vegetarian diet. There is marathon runners and things like that who have done it.
No, there's lots of vegan weightlifters and bodybuilders now, and in fact, some of the best. There's a lot of myths about you get this, that, and the other from animal sources. When you actually check it out, the better sources of all of those things tend to be plant-based, and so.
For example.
Well, just in terms of just about anything about. Obviously, in terms of veganism, there are issues about certain things like vitamin B12 and those kind of issues. So, those are issues. But in terms of the fundamental nutritional requirements, then the vegan diet is adequate and throughout all the ages of life. And, we've got, dietetic associations all around the world stating that. So, veganism is not a problem nutritionally, it's a problem socially. And when going back to your point, there are, as you said, there are lots of the kind of endurance kind of sports people who are vegans, running up and down mountains and all that. They tend to be a lot of vegans, the triathlons, that kind of thing. But there are quite a lot now of vegan bodybuilders, and it's quite easy to Google it, and you'll find them. I mean, one guy I think is called Robert Creek, who's a big name within it. But I mean, the vegan bodybuilders now are winning prizes and stuff, so it's not as if,
no, because it is very, very difficult to get the sort of the ease of access. You certainly have to consider what you're eating far more, I'd imagine, to get the required level of protein.
Well, yeah, I mean, but on a general level, you could make that case. I mean, I read labels, you might not.
Not really.
But I tend not to see that as a terrible kind of burden to because see, the thing is, at the end of my day, I don't feel a sense of deprivation about being a vegan, which often from the outside might seem to be the case. They're giving up this, and they're against that, and but there's a lot that vegans get, and there's a lot that we're for, like peace and justice and this kind of stuff. But also, what we do get is a sense of well-being at the end of the day, because we know that we haven't deliberately exploited anyone.
Okay, I still find it very interesting that you refer to animals as any one or things. That's something usually reserved for. Well,
if you look at legal categories, there are two legal categories, and other animals actually are in an interesting position because you've got persons and things. Yeah. Now, that's the legal construct. Now, sometimes corporations are placed into the persons side of it. So it's not as though, so we're not equating persons with people. Okay. So you could have a legal person who is not human. Yeah, so you could have that. It's feasible.
I think it was Mitt Romney who recently said something along the effect of corporations are people too.
Well, I'm not going to cite.
No, it's just
yeah. So in those terms, and there's a great animal rights philosopher called Tom Reagan, and he says that other animals are some bodies and not some things. In other words, he says that they're subjects of a life. What that means is that they've got a psychological life, they've got a physical life, which matters to them. What happens to them matters to them, because they're aware. Now, there are lots of arguments about self-awareness at the moment, but it's quite interesting that there's a new academic discipline called cognitive ethology, which is showing, because in recent years, we've started to research other animals, not as exploiters of them. We know a lot about how to exploit them and how to use them. We're now starting to look at them in terms of their abilities and capacities, and we're finding things which are astounding us, like proto-morality. There's case after case now where other animals have saved other animals, and not ironically, going back to your first point really, not even of their own species. So you've got a lot of other animals who will rescue, animals of other species. And so this discipline is teaching us that there's a lot more going on in non-humans than we previously thought. Or, from an exploiter's point of view, if you like, to use that language, more than we want to think. Because obviously the first thing that someone does who wants to exploit another is to reduce them in status. Okay? When you start to learn about their capacities, then you get a situation where you might have to reconsider.
You touched on something in there. You mentioned awareness and self-awareness. And just before we move on too far past that, is awareness the key issue for you in terms of eating meat? Is it that they are aware on their own?
Well, I mean, that goes back to something that's been bouncing around Facebook today, which is a Jeremy Bentham quote, which is, it doesn't matter if they can't speak or they can't reason, it's can they suffer? Okay. And so that fed into Somebody mentioned on Facebook that probably Peter Singer would be mentioned today, and it's likely, but Peter Singer is not an animal rights advocate. He's a utilitarian philosopher. And so, but he picked up on the Bentham thing about sentiency, effectively, that they can suffer, and also they can feel pain. And also the law reflects that. So animal welfare law says that you can't do things to them which are very negative. You can't do things like terrorize them.
Yes.
So it recognizes the fact that other animals can be in a state of terror. So animal welfare law is quite interesting in that sense. It's kind of on that level. It's quite advanced. Yeah. Then you've got newer ideas from Reagan in the shape of Danae mentioned and Gary Francione and a few other philosophers who have gone back to Singer's idea of sentiency, but constructed a rights-based argument on that. So this awareness thing is crucial, because if you're not aware, then you don't have an interest like plants. And so consequently, what we would argue is that sentiency is the key. And there is another philosopher called Richard Ryder, and he says that we can make sense. Everybody in this room should be able to make sense of a moral category called the sentience. In other words, there's something about being sentient that's important. And if you look in terms of human rights, then you would immediately start thinking about the right not to be tortured, a negative right. Well, that applies to other animals as well. This is why we're trying to get other animals, we're trying to kind of punch holes, if you like, in the species barrier, which you're relying on in a sense. Although, I mean, it's interesting, your argument is quite interesting, because you're also saying you don't really care about other humans that much either, so it's just fine.
I will make the point that if it came to a situation where in order to survive, I would have to eat human meat, I probably would, if it was a plane crash or similar. I doubt I'd kill someone to do it. I think that would be a line too far. But certainly, what's the film where it happened?
Argentinian.
Yeah, the Argentinian, certainly where they ate. Apparently alive, yeah. Apparently tastes like chicken. I would.
Well, we are made of meat, huh?
We are made of meat, exactly. But everything tastes like chicken. Can they not be more imaginative with that? I would have thought we'd be closer to pork than chicken.
Would you? Well, you might be.
Probably just like a chicken drumstick or something.
I'm a bit string at this stage. Actually, there is a film on YouTube which is aliens sat in a cafe, and one of them was kind of reporting to the other, like a Mork and Mindy type situation, and he said, what's the score? And he said, well, they're made out of meat. And he goes, what do you mean, these humans are made out of meat? That's essentially what we are. I don't think he tasted them, in terms of that. But yeah, it is a cliche that we do supposed to taste of chickens.
Everything tastes of chickens.
Yeah. It's all the processing.
Yeah, so we were discussing about the awareness being an issue for you. I did a bit of research for this, obviously, but the thing that had come up before...
You've been Googling, haven't you?
Not that much. I'm very busy recently. I saw it a while back, and I found the article again today, and it was in the Huffington Post. And it was an architecture student in the UK, I'm sure you came across it, who, for an arts project, essentially, in order to challenge assumptions and things like that, created a design whereby you would sever a chicken's frontal cortex, essentially at birth, and then plug it into a matrix-like machine, where it's fed, and there's enough of the brainstem left that it's kept alive. It's able to have its bodily functions, it's able to grow, it's able to do that. But anything that makes it a chicken or aware that it's a chicken or anything like that is totally severed. It's literally brain dead. And then, rather than growing battery chickens, where they do indeed suffer and things like that, by severing it at birth when they are essentially too young.
Yeah. Actually, there have been people working on that kind of thing, and often the tabloid press will call it Frankenstein food.
Yeah,
right. But people have been working on that for a long time. Now, I remember from the 80s, there used to be in Cambridge, there was a laboratory called Babraham, and they were doing experiments to kind of create a legless, featherless chicken, which effectively was almost like a square block of meat, really. So there's been a lot of that, and of course now the kind of modern version of that is these moves to bring about the petri dish meat, the laboratory meat, and so there was a very interesting discussion about that from somebody within the animal movement who was for it, and somebody in the animal movement was against this idea on a blog, and it's called The Vegan Option. It's really well worth listening to, because at the moment, because it's in its experimental stage, then they are using things like stem cells. Yeah. There is a suggestion that we'll get to a stage where you can create meat which has got no animal component, even kind of historically. And also, it's interesting, I personally would eat laboratory meat if it was from a human donor. I wouldn't see a problem with that.
All right.
Ironically, a religious person might.
Yeah.
But, we probably wouldn't. So it is the ability to suffer the awareness and the fact that for me, other animals are someone else. And just as somebody said recently, when you're dealing with eating meat or using other animals, someone else is involved. And that's what makes it a moral issue for me.
Okay. So you have less issue with the chickens with their frontal cortex cut off then?
Well, obviously that in itself is an experiment, so that brings in the vivisection argument. So yes, I would, but in terms of the resulting being, as a non-suffering person, some people have been talking within our movement about whether it would be morally acceptable, for example, to eat roadkill. On the grounds that no one deliberately killed this being.
I think it's some sects of Buddhism that it's forbidden to slaughter meat, but eating meat itself isn't. So they would drive animals off cliffs because then God killed them, not them.
Well, I think you might have to look at intent.
Yeah. The road come argument. Oh, look at cats.
Right. I'm not quite sure where I can go with that.
But what was the opinion then? What was the sort of the stance on that?
Well, it gets around some of the ethical issues, but it doesn't resolve the social movement issue. Yeah. And so, if you look at the definition of veganism, it's that vegans don't use and consume animal products. Yeah. Okay. And other definitions are that vegans don't want to exploit or be cruel or cause suffering, that kind of stuff now. So it deals with that element of it. Yeah. In the same way as it would if you were to suddenly go around the corner and you think, dead human body hamburger, which you might, right? And so
it's nice to see you already have such a low opinion. Yeah. It normally takes a few weeks of knowing me to get to that stage.
I'm just feeding off your argument.
Hopefully not feeding off me just yet.
No, not quite. I was warned about you.
Warned about me?
Yeah, not enough.
Who was warning you?
Nah.
Who don't have to have words for that?
I was told that you had a wicked sense of humour. That's obviously true. So what were we saying? It must have been something serious, obviously.
Clearly. Just to do with the awareness issue and the...
Yeah, so, to go back to that, in terms of the social movement, obviously, if you like, something that was rather mocked actually, but if you like, the spirit of veganism is not moving towards trying to work out in what circumstances vegans can eat meat. The spirit of veganism is to create a society which wouldn't want to go there. Yeah. Okay. But in terms of that other ethical issue about suffering and everything, that will be resolved by that. And the same, or less so, I think, would be your chicken example, because obviously you've got a very invasive situation at the beginning, which we would probably class as an example of vivisection.
Well, I personally prefer chicken like that than I would battery chicken or whatever, simply because I'm not utterly heartless. I do think that the meat I eat should suffer as little as possible. Now, there is obviously a very hard surface on that limit, since I'm killing them or having them killed and then eating them. So there's only a slight limit to what the suffering could be defined as. But I certainly would rather they weren't tortured while they were alive.
What about other types of uses? There's been an interesting discussion online recently in a petition at the moment, because there's a new film, a new documentary, I think it's called Donkey Love, and it's about Colombian men who have sex with donkeys. So this takes us into this takes us into issues like bestiality, as it's traditionally called, or the sexual exploitation of other animals, this kind of stuff. But it's quite interesting because even from an animal welfare point of view, that's quite a difficult subject because a lot of people react to it because it's a taboo.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting because people who are quite happy to stick knives and forks into other animals when they're dead and are happy for that kind of activity to go on. So if there was no suffering, from your point of view, anything would go, wouldn't it?
In terms of what? In terms
well,
of
you're saying,
yeah. Well, personally, I'm not sexually attracted to animals.
No, but if no, I'm not trying to lead you into a dark alley right
I hope not. No. When you mentioned the film was called Donkey Love, I genuinely thought that was not going to be like.
Yeah. Okay. So, see, the thing is, we first started talking about how the fact that you in a sense resisted your socialization and I resisted my socialization. In terms of how we are brought up in a species society, the ideology of animal welfare is built into that.
Yeah.
And essentially, what most users of other animals say is what you just said a few minutes ago, which is that, I'll use them, I'll eat them, I'll consume them, I'll use them for other purposes, but I don't want them to see them tortured, and in fact, if they had a fine knife, that would be great. So that's the kind of animal welfare side of this issue.
Yeah, so back to your bestiality point, which I didn't think was coming up, so I didn't study it. Yeah, to me, the issue isn't so much the abuse of the animals there, it's what's going on in the person's head who would do that. In the same way that some people are attracted to animals, some people are attracted to children, and it's undeniable that there is something non-normal in their psychology. I should know how to pronounce that actually. Studying it. In their psychology, that's letting them do that. So I don't think there's really an animal welfare argument there, because for someone to be sexually attracted to a donkey is yes, odd.
Well, in terms of their argument, this is a cultural phenomenon which is entirely rational, in the sense that, well, first of all, there's a medical belief that it makes the male penis bigger, but also it's a very Catholic country, and so that means that you got a lot of frustrated guys, and the idea is, so the medical profession would actually recommend that men do this, okay, and in the sense, it would be that one of the rationales would be that it would cut down the amount of sexualized abuse of women. Yeah, and so from their own internal logic, there is a rationale which kind of makes sense internally. Yeah. Now, the reason that I brought it up is because for us, it's an issue of animal use, and for us, that would be one form of animal use, which is obviously not socially sanctioned.
No.
Yeah. Whereas what we're dealing with when we walk out on the street is there is lots of forms of animal use which are. So for a vegan walking around in society can be quite a painful situation in the sense that you see the leather, you see the fur, you see the wool, and you see the McDonald's and everything else. Okay. And these are just, to us, forms of animal use. Yeah. So I was just trying to tease out how you would construct a barrier between those forms of use, if it met the criteria of animal welfare. That's what I was trying to get at.
Well, yeah, as I said, it's not so much an issue of animal suffering for me, it's more of a, what the hell is that person doing? I'd be much more interested in...
But in theory, if you were brought up in that kind of society, then, and you were socialised into that kind of society, you'd probably be okay about it, so long as the welfare...
Possibly,
yeah.